I'm a big reader. So I had all of my books on what they should do and how they should do it, how we introduce this new CTO to his new organization, and how we introduce this new CPO to her organization. And I noticed that the guidance or the structure or the processes we went through for him worked pretty much as the book said that it would. And then for her, it didn't. And I didn't really understand, but I was annoyed. One, because I want her to do as well in her job as he does, but two, because I want to be giving good advice.
For many of us, when we hit an obstacle or realize there's something we don't know how to do, a key place to go for guidance, for knowledge, is reading, whether it's books, online guides, or academic papers. But what happens when those written materials don't help? When they give advice that just doesn't apply to you or doesn't work in practice? After discovering that exact problem for women in leadership, particularly senior leadership roles, Libby Vincent, my guest today, has set out to solve it. Libby spent 15 years in tech leadership roles, is a founder, a board member, and a community chair. She has founded Hodology, a consultancy helping ambitious teams become powerful communities through inclusive leadership. And today she works with women in senior roles to support them on that journey. And before we start, another reminder for you, listener. Being a leader can be a lonely journey. We've all experienced that at some point in our leadership careers, especially so for new managers and people working in technology and specialist-driven environments. You can break that isolation through things like networking, such as by joining my online leadership community, Integrity Leaders. Right now, any podcast listener is welcome to join. You can do so with a 60-day free trial. All I ask in return is some honest feedback to help us build and improve what we're offering. And there is a no-fee membership option at the end of the 60 days too, so don't feel like you're tying yourself into anything. So take that leap today and join the Integrity Leaders community. You can visit www.leadernotaboss.com to find out how.
Welcome to the Leading with Integrity podcast. Leadership talk for the modern manager. With your host, David Hatch.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Leading with Integrity. And I'm joined today by another brilliant guest, Libby Vincent. Libby, thank you very much for joining me from not very sunny southern England today. Looking forward to getting into our conversation.
I love talking about leadership, despite it being a frosty day in Kingston today.
We'll kick off the conversation really by handing over to you a little bit to tell the listeners about yourself, your background, your career so far. What gets you out of bed in the morning?
Okay, I will introduce myself first. My name is Libby Vincent, and I am the founder of an organization called Hodology. I also have a couple of non-executive director roles as well. But to explain how I got here, I have a bit of a squiggly career path. So I was smart enough to go to university, and I am old enough that it wasn't a financial implication of making that choice. So I went to uni, but then didn't apply myself, and I left and I got a bar job and I ran music venues, and I wasn't sure of what I was doing until I was, let's say, 30. Or coming up on that milestone thinking, do I really want to spend the rest of my life arguing with tour managers? So the career, as I describe it today, or the reason we're talking today, is only really 10 years long. It's from that period of deciding I don't want to be working in bars and hospitality for the rest of my life, to maybe 2 or 3 years ago, where I was 2 seats down from a CEO of a FTSE 50 tech organization. So once I entered corporate life, the corporate world, I found that I moved very quickly up through different grades, different levels of leadership, that I was able to, in that quite short period of time, become a manager of managers, lead international teams, lead distributed teams, and of course, that baptism of fire that was leading large distributed international teams through the pandemic, where we all learned what it was like to motivate and build trust at scale and at a distance. I got through that baptism. And so at the end of the pandemic, as we saw things going back to normal, that's when I decided I wanted to move into independent employment. I also turned 40 at that time. And there is nothing like a milestone birthday to give you some perspective on life. And so I started my own leadership consultancy. I work specifically with women navigating periods of change. So if they are moving into a new role, if they are transitioning through mergers and acquisition activity, or if something about the organization around them is changing. So those periods of potential instability in your careers, supporting them through consultancy and executive coaching.
Wow. Okay. Quite a varied journey then.
Now, right?
Was there a particular experience you've had that's led you into focusing on helping women in leadership, or is it part of a wider story that we're going to talk about in a minute?
It isn't as virtuous as you might think. So I was in a role where I was helping combine executive teams. So it was post-mergers. There were 2 very large mergers in an organization that I worked at. And my role was to help onboard new members of the executive and to combine pre-existing executive teams so that they functioned as one high-performing team, which had the additional complication that they had previously been competitors. So how do we get people in the same room to work together quickly enough so that the business doesn't stumble? And I'm a big reader. So I had all of my books on what they should do and how they should do it, how we introduce this new CTO to his new organization, and how we introduce this new CPO to her organization. And I noticed that the guidance or the structure or the processes we went through for him worked pretty much as the book said that it would. And then for her, it didn't. And I didn't really understand, but I was annoyed. 1, because I want her to do as well in her job as he does, but 2, because I want to be giving good advice. And when you have that perspective on large-scale disruption within large organizations, you see lots of people moving into new roles, moving around the organization, faced with new challenges. And the men that were moving were finding it much simpler to build influence, credibility, and trust with the teams that they were leading than the women were. And it looked to me as if that additional pressure or those stumbles became bigger tumbles, and they were moving out of those roles more quickly. So through that process of instability, some leaders were managing to hang on more securely than others. And I just wanted to understand why. So I took my books and I got into the footnotes and I read the papers, which are dry, like academic papers. One, they sometimes have fascinating titles that make them sound like they're going to be really sexy and interesting. But that's it. Afterwards, it's just a lot of pouring through the paperwork. I read those and then I started to read the papers that weren't included in these books. And there is decades, not just 1 or 2, but thousands of papers over 10, 20, 30, longer, looking at how the experience of women in large organizations is different to that of their male counterparts. But it doesn't bubble through. It's not in the leadership books that you take from the shelf. It's not in the best-selling books, because the reality of selling a best-selling book is that you need to write it for most of the people who will read it, which means you get generic leadership advice, which doesn't always directly apply to leaders who don't fit that mold of what we might expect. And so it was that gap between the information that was available in the books, the information that's available if you crack open those vaults of academia. I mean, they're on Google Scholar. You don't need to go up to the British Library. It's not like Indiana Jones and you're requesting these vellum pages to pour through. You can get them. They're on the internet. But it was that gap felt unfair. And when you look at studies that measure the average tenure of CEOs, the average tenure of a male CEO is 9.9 years, and the average tenure of a female CEO is 6.6 years. And to work your whole life to make sacrifices and to focus on this amazing achievement, because CEOs are by every measure exceptional. Not everybody is going to be a CEO. To do that and to get there, another frustrating number is that most C-suite successions fail in the first 18 months. To have spent decades getting to a position that you then struggle to hang on to for 2 years because there isn't the information that's relevant to you at your fingertips just seemed outrageously unfair. And so that was the gap that I stepped into, partly by design and partly because I was asked. I had people who had moved out of organizations I'd worked in, and when they started new roles, they said, can you help me do here what you helped me do there? And I said, yeah, I mean, why not? So that's how I got into working with women, seeing that gap and wanting to be able to bridge that unfairness to level the playing field a little.
Yeah. So there is quite a virtuous intent behind it, actually, despite how you started that answer.
Oh, thank you.
I mean, it is annoying, isn't it? Just at an academic level, even about if you buy a book to learn how to do something, it should teach you how to do something, right? Like that is annoying. I get that.
Right.
Yeah. And I agree. It is terribly unfair just in general. And I think this is an interesting subject that we've talked about in the past with previous guests about the disparity, particularly in companies at the level of the FTSE 100, for example, about, senior levels of leadership, executive, and we look at it on like gender or economic or any of those similar, race is the other big one, of course. We look at it on any of those terms and there is a very clear disparity. I can't remember the exact numbers off the top of my head, so I won't misquote, but they're not high.
They are not high. There's always those headlines that say there's more Daves than there are women and there's more Pauls than there are black CEOs.
Yeah.
These quite clickbaity headlines will come around every now and again. But you're absolutely right. When you look at the image of who sits in that chair, it's quite a narrow demographic.
Mm.
So one of the reasons that I work specifically with women is I have read a lot of the useful information to them. I would love to be equally informed on working with executives who identify as LGBT plus or people of color or people from low socioeconomic backgrounds who are now the only one in their executive team who didn't attend a fee-paying school, and all of the intersections of those different identities. But there is so much complexity there that you kind of need to, I'm now falling into the trap of the books that I was frustrated with, to become valuable source of information for one, means that you really are just reading on that one subject. But hopefully there will be others that will come up and fill the gaps for other people.
I think there definitely are, firstly, but secondly, we're only one person each, aren't we? Like, there's only so much you can do. So, I think you're doing the right thing. And going back to, from the point of view of the female executive as well, and getting women into leadership roles, I mean, it's, as I say, it's something we've talked about before, but I think it's quite a different angle to how I've heard it discussed before, because where you're coming from is it's more about the lack of resources and information that works for those people in those roles. Whereas most of the conversation, I think, certainly that I've heard or been part of, is more about attracting people to those roles rather than preparing them for those roles, if that makes sense.
Does make sense. And there are some interesting studies that look at the number of early career women who are applying for their first leadership role, because there's been lots of incredible work that's been done inside organizations and through independent pressure groups or training organizations to help improve the processes once somebody has that first leadership role. But you still need people to want to do it. So a study looked at the lower number of women who were going for that first leadership role, and through their qualitative analysis, so they did interviews afterwards to understand what happened with these numbers, the early career women expected management to be much harder than it is. So everybody understands that management, at some point you need to deal with some conflict. At some point you need to tell somebody something they don't want to hear, and it's going to be uncomfortable for everyone. And it doesn't happen all the time. You're not once a week letting somebody go or managing a disciplinary or an argument between two people, hopefully. I mean, if you are, there's perhaps other questions about what's going on in the organization. Yeah,
I was going to say, not in a healthy company.
Not in a healthy company. But I do worry sometimes that when there is a lot of talk about how difficult it is for women to be leadership, that we lose part of the message, that it is a brilliant job. Being a leader is great. You get to have a vision, you get to steer direction, you get to inspire people, you get to help others become better, you get paid more as well. So you can do things in your own life for yourself, for your family, or the people you care about. It's an incredible opportunity. But when we focus on how hard it is, how many barriers are in place, how few of us make it through, how difficult it is to overcome those barriers. And when we see women who are making incredible sacrifices to hold on to those roles, and they don't look like they're enjoying it, they look like this is a burden that they have to carry on behalf of the rest of us, it can feel really difficult sell to expect younger women to move into this role. So that's a part of why I wanted to help support these senior women, both to keep those roles for longer, so it doesn't seem like such a risk to move up. Because if you see people moving up and then moving out, why would you follow? And if you see people moving up and not enjoying it and struggling with the politics of it, or struggling with personal balance, or finding it a burden because a disproportionate number of the difficult conversations or caregiving conversations are landing on that member of the executive team, then I can understand why you go, no, I'm not up for it. So I think it's two sides of the same coin, that there are things that are stopping women from making that move up. And sometimes it's just that we're not talking loudly enough about how great it can be, and we're talking a little bit too loudly about how difficult it can be.
Yeah, I of course agree with you. It is an amazing job. And I think you're right. There is a danger there for any of these overlooked groups, let's call them, where, you if the narrative is all about trying to persuade people to do it or make it easier for them to do it, part of that has to be about showing what a great thing it is and how amazing it can be when you get that kind of role. I mean, just being able to make a difference in people's lives that was always enough for me, at least. All the other things were nice to have, really. But follow-up question I have about, you mentioned about the 18 months to 2 years and how quickly people fail. Is that everyone in any CEO role, or how does that change based on, say, whether they're a man or a woman, for example?
I don't know. That's a McKinsey number, and they said C-suite. So,
okay. I'd be interested to know, because I feel like most of the female leaders who get to that level, certainly the ones I've met, are way better than their male counterparts. So I'd feel like they would probably last longer, but I don't know.
There are lots of conversations around a thing called the glass cliff, which is women are promoted into senior positions in organizations which are already failing, perhaps because they are seen as caregivers, or that they can somehow nurture an organization back to health. Sometimes because the board go, well, we've tried everything else, so we might as well, and it becomes a bit of a Hail Mary. Sometimes because it is a hospital pass. They know which way the organization is going, and nobody's going to sell that position to one of their bros. You might think of some of our female prime ministers when you consider at what time they've had an opportunity to take that role and the economic conditions that they were faced with, or the referendums that they were faced with. There are other studies that look at how emotionally engaged a predominantly male leadership team are with a female CEO, for example, because if you have spent most of your career being able to look up and see somebody who looks like you, it can be a different experience to looking up and seeing somebody that doesn't. And whether it is conscious or unconscious, even a slight withdrawal of support can have a huge impact, especially if the organization is already struggling. But I am paraphrasing, boiling down an entire book, which is fascinating, that looks at the conditions under which female CEOs may find themselves in a more difficult position than some of their male counterparts. The caveat with all of this is that there aren't as many. So as many studies as you want to do and as many numbers as you want to churn out, the statistical relevance looking at female versus male CEOs, when there's such a small percentage, I think there's 10 in the FTSE 100 right now, it's always going to have a margin of error, right? And there is more that is different about each of those individuals than there are that brings them together. Even to label them female CEOs does a disservice, because they are all entirely different, just as all male CEOs are entirely different. It just becomes quite a crude way to start carving up groups to say we have too many of these and not enough of those.
Good point. Yeah, I do try to use the opposite as well when I say male CEO.
Male CEO.
At least, but yeah, I mean, if it is 10 or less, I mean, that was about where I was remembering that study, but I wasn't 100% sure, so I didn't want to say it. But I think you're right. I mean, the problem of sample size, if you've got 10% or less of any given population, you're never really going to get a meaningful understanding of the trends, the dynamics, the what's and the whys and the hows behind something like that over such a big potential pool where it's all the rest are males, or right. Old white males usually. But.
Right. People throw out different hypotheses and they write books on it and papers and Harvard Business Review articles, and there becomes an entire industry which seems focused on just discussing what some of the challenges are and looking at it from different angles and saying, well, if this or if that, which academically is fascinating. But does it move the needle? Do we need to move past introspection and into action if we want to see that 10 become 20 or 30?
Well, I think yes. It's interesting as well, because all of that introspection, all of that it's not just theory, is it? It's speculation almost. Yeah. Because there's no data really to support it. And if there is, there's not going to be enough of it to be robust and trustworthy enough to draw a conclusion, I think. So if you can't do that, then the answer to your question, yes, we've got to take action first in order to generate that data, in order to then build upon it, and it hopefully becomes self-fulfilling eventually. So another point you made that I'd like to pick up on that's quite interesting is about selecting the female CEO. I've used the inverted commas there for people who aren't watching the video version, because they are perceived as more caring or more empathetic and so on. Now, those are key qualities in my book for effective leadership. So do you think part of the conversation also needs to be about making the male CEOs better at those things too, and thereby remove that kind of false justification, if you like, for selecting on the hospital path, as you said.
Absolutely, 100%. That it's not, the challenge is not that there are not enough women in these roles. The challenge is that there are too many people which are thinking and behaving in similar ways in these roles. And that to bring diversity into that group, we are forced to measure by other things like colour and age and gender. But it is a disservice to women to conceptualize all female leaders as belonging to the same bucket. There is, remember I said some academic papers have fabulous names. There's one called Heavier Lies Her Crown, and it's a meta-analysis, but it looks at the emotional labour which is placed upon women because of this expectation. And it is often unpaid, it's often undervalued, and for many women, it's not a natural sense that they want to care and look after for the organization, but so they feel it as an additional burden. But when you live in a society which devalues a group of behaviors, there was a psychologist referred to them as communal behaviors. When you devalue them socially, and these are things like collaboration, empathy, compromise, and you overvalue another group of behaviors, which are referred to as agentic. So these are the kind of top-down decision-making, directive, command and control behaviors. You promote those that demonstrate agentic behaviors, and you devalue those that don't. And the reason I use agentic and communal is because they are not attached to feminine and masculine in the way that they were in Victorian times when people were still having these conversations. So I would love to see more leaders generally demonstrating these communal skills of collaboration, compromise, dealing with ambiguity, leading through influence rather than authority. I think that we're seeing again and again how valuable these skills are. We live in a society where 50% has been socialized to behave more in this way than the other. But the opposite is true. For as many women that are adopting behaviors that they feel are necessary to be seen as appropriately feminine, there are men who are adopting behaviors because they are appropriately masculine. There is a self-harm and suicide epidemic for men in the UK who feel unable to show signs of weakness, to seek support. We see decisions being made in large organizations by men who are risking their own personal health because of the stress of the role that they're in, of their inability to delegate or to work with a wider leadership team, who are hospitalizing themselves because of the pressure they're putting on themselves to maintain a persona which we associate with leadership. So absolutely, we want to see a good breadth of communal behaviors in leadership and to be offset by agentic. I heard somebody say that this is why the Beatles was great, because it had Paul and John, and then when they went separately, it just wasn't the same magic, right? So what you need is the mix of them. However that lands in that room, whatever that looks like, comes through people's history, comes through their natural aptitude, but it also comes through what is socially deemed acceptable for them, right? I used my air quotes there, acceptable.
Yeah, I do agree. I think for me, it's two sides of the same problem to an extent. I think leadership is best when it is those more modern values, the empathy, the collaboration, the caring about your people, all of these things that traditionally are not seen as good things in leadership. And I say that with a big pinch of salt. And we think about things like this idea of, I mean, you called it command and control, the autocratic leadership, the kind of the perceived dictator, that whole ethos around leadership. It is a constant source of frustration to me how persistent that is, even in this day and age. And for me, it's not just about the fact that the modern kind and caring approach to leadership is more effective. It's that the older school style is proven ineffective.
Yeah.
It damages organizations. It ruins teamwork. It causes all kinds of problems there's studies again, which I won't misquote the numbers, but they correlate these kinds of leadership approaches, these older versions of it, to things like staff retention, employee engagement, happiness at work even. And then when you add on top of it as well, it's bad for the individual leaders themselves. And we're assuming again that there's a correlation between male leaders here. I think there's probably a fair percentage as well of female leaders who are emulating those behaviors in order to succeed in leadership, because that's the environments that they're working within. And it all just becomes a vicious cycle, doesn't it? And it really winds me up.
And I completely agree. There will be female leaders who are emulating these agentic behaviors because that's what's expected of leadership in that industry or their organization. There's also a experience called stereotype threat, where if any part of your identity is, what people say about people like you, right? You get an idea and you are damned if you are going to prove them right. And so you do something that goes against it. So if you go, well, I don't want to be too soft because then they'll think that I'm just being a woman and I'm too soft. And so I will be harder, but then you are harder than you would have otherwise have been. And you become more concerned with managing the stereotype or the perception of you than the impact of the work that you're doing. But it's, that sense of falsehood in the way people are showing up. I think it goes back to, because we even use it in our language a lot, is this military leadership. And I understand if the decisions you made were literally sending people to their death, then I understand why it's important to have a level of emotional detachment. Right? If you are moving I imagine everyone has a big map, and you're moving little blocks around your map, and you're getting numbers back from the front lines. Emotional detachment is necessary for your ability to make those decisions. But we're not leading military campaigns anymore. And you hear it in some of the language that we see. So like hit the ground running is a military phrase. When we talk, even when we talk about chief of staff and chief of technology, that's all military phrases. I think the two are so closely entwined that it's really difficult to unpick where some of these ideas come from about what it means to be in charge.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, again, there's more of them, aren't there? Over the top. There's no one. I mean, even more basic words like strategy versus tactics. I mean, those are very militaristic words. And I blame Hollywood for this, to be honest, because, the Grand War movie, the heroic leader, that person on the pedestal, I think that's how it's entered the consciousness. But it is another misconception though, because even in the military, the times that they will treat people that way are very, very limited circumstances. Most of the time, in the modern armed forces at least, they treat people much better, and there is that caring aspect. And I think that again, it gets lost. There's a misunderstanding of people I'm going to say this having not served myself, but people who haven't served and looking at it from the outside and then watching the war films and the Hollywoodization of it all, and then getting this false understanding of it. But if you talk to veterans and people who've actually served, it's very limited, as I say, circumstances where that is the kind of leadership they have to adopt. And it is very situational.
We just movies. Are we going to blame Hollywood?
Yes, definitely. I think so. It's probably their fault. Portraying something because it's going to sell tickets to a film doesn't necessarily mean it's in any way realistic or factual, does it? But, there we go.
I don't know that I would want to watch a Hollywood movie that was a realistic meeting.
It'd be quite boring, wouldn't it?
Yeah. It would be like... The
length would probably be about the same, but nothing would happen.
But it would have other sequels.
True.
It was difficult to tell what made them significantly different from the first one.
Yeah. Except they all start to look a bit older and more tired between sequels.
Yeah.
One thing I know you've spoken about is this idea of the hidden rules. So I'm really curious if you can share a story with us about a time where understanding those hidden rules could have changed the trajectory of someone, perhaps someone that you've worked with or a CEO that you know.
There's a double bind that everybody talks about women in leadership, where if you are seen to demonstrate these communal behaviors, you're not strong enough to be a leader. But if you are seen as too agentic, then it doesn't fit with being a woman, and so it feels false. There's another double bind about authenticity as well, which has become a bit of a buzzword in leadership recently, where if you share something about yourself which doesn't align with your identity. So we see women saying, I love, they really enjoy boxing, for example, or they really enjoy video games, or things which people might not expect when they look at them. It feels inauthentic. And so authenticity is less a thing that you do, and it's more a thing you are perceived to be. And I think sometimes that gets lost. And that's one of those hidden rules that comes up. The way in which you act needs to align or be consistent with the way that people perceive you. But where it can trip some female leaders up is this idea of personal brand and in allowing people to get to know you. Because the more they get to know you, when we meet new people, we want to tell them everything about us. And we feel there's a sense of the more I tell you about me, the better you know me, the better you trust me. But when you are in leadership, when you tell the same story or tell different stories to lots of different people, each person hears a different story and then they talk about you. Because that's what people do. Everybody talks about the boss and they swap stories and they're not the same. And it doesn't create this multi-sided, complex image of a interesting person with lots of stories. It lands as inconsistency. So when I spoke to her, she talked about horse riding. And when I spoke to her, she talked about her kids. Well, how does that join up? When did these pieces don't quite fit together? And one of the hidden rules is that for women in leadership, who you are seems to matter a lot more. So that sense of being known as a person, being understood for both what you can do professionally, but also your personally, this personal brand builds that credibility and trust that sometimes male leaders can take for granted. Not out of any laziness, it just seems to be there more credibly than others. And so this is one of the stumbles that I've seen a couple of the women I work with go for, where they have tried to land in an organization and either not shared anything about themselves because they're focused on the strategy and the tactics and the teams, and they found it difficult to build trust because people don't know who they are, or they have come in with a variety of stories and anecdotes, and this is who I am, this is what's important to me. But when they are talked about, they don't come together in a cohesive view, especially when you're working at scale and everybody is on. This is something that's happened since the pandemic. You can give a keynote and people are discussing it with each other while you are still speaking. The thing that you said a minute ago, somebody has already grabbed and they've got a GIF and they've got a video of it. Hang on, I'll share that clip. Did you miss it? All while you are still speaking. So the real-time interpretation of what you're saying is incredible. The scrutiny is absolutely off the chart. So things like this, they're not quite hidden rules, but they are considerations which women that are being perceived or have lots of people trying to figure, everyone wants to know who the new boss is, right? But that two-way, letting them know who you are, as well as understanding what the organization does, is far more important for women coming into senior roles than it is for men.
An interesting take on authenticity as well, which I don't disagree with. It reminds me slightly of one of these big double standards that you hear a lot about, women versus men versus, it's the wrong word, but you know what I mean. When it comes to leadership, or really just professional life in general, where if a man, all they do is focus on work, they don't have a life outside of work, and if they do, they never talk about it. And that's perceived as being a good thing and being a positive role model and a hard worker and all of that sort of thing. Whereas if a woman were to do the same thing, they get a lot of judgment for it and a lot of, well, what about the rest of your life?
Yeah.
And do you think these two problems maybe go together, or am I stretching that a bit?
There is a sense, there's certainly a lot of writing around women in leadership, which is about work-life balance and sustainable balance and sustainable lifestyle, that I don't see in more generic leadership advice. In startups and small organizations where people are putting a lot of effort in. The other place you might see it is in professions which require 100% of you. So top level cooking, for example. If you are working in a restaurant, that is your life until you become that Michelin-starred chef. And there's a gender disparity there. So there is sometimes a view that women can have work with everything else, but if she has failed to have everything else, she has failed. Right? This question of can you have it all, which is, I mean, problematic in itself, because who has it all? What an unbelievable standard to set for anybody. Is it possible to have everything? No. I mean, who has everything? But why would you direct that at one group and not the other? It's
Incredibly 1950s, that, isn't it? And well, 60s, Mad Men kind of era. It's just, yeah.
It feels like that. I think it was the 80s. I think it was the 80s that came out, and it was a challenge. It was a feminist rallying cry about being able to do all of these things. But it was based on the idea that you were given permission to have a career as long as it didn't interrupt your key and main responsibilities, which were household, wifery. You could have the balance of the two. But yeah, it's that sense of authenticity is difficult for everyone. And I think it absolutely has become a bit of a zeitgeist in leadership, which has lots of the challenge that I mentioned, but what does authentic mean if you are not perceived to be authentic? It kind of falls flat. It also doesn't work particularly well for introverts or some people who identify as neurodivergent, because we conflate authenticity with an all or nothing kind of social media status. Here's my entire life and everything about me is what's necessary to be deemed authentic. And we get lots of podcasts of people and floods of peers, and it's like it's a televised therapy session. And this is what's necessary to being able to connect with people and be a manager. And people go, I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to air my personal life for the benefit of a 10 grand extra a year. And so I'll just stay here because privacy is important. And I think that's something we've lost sight of. The authenticity means that it is a reflection of you. It doesn't need to be all of you all of the time, and you just trust that people will be kind to whoever that is. I don't think that's available to everybody. And also for a lot of us, our authentic selves are not palatable in a professional sense, right? There's lots of conversations about menopause and menopausal symptoms, but for our entire hormonal life, for women to come to work and go, actually, I can't do it. You should be able to. But if you have ever tried to explain to a group of male colleagues how you are feeling today as a result of your hormones, you can feel the chill in the air, right? If you want to deal with a hot flush, you can feel the temperature drop as you try and explain it to everybody.
It's one potential solution, I suppose, a novel approach. Yeah.
Make it really frosty. But the same is true for people of the LGBT community, people who are neurodivergent, but however you spend your time outside of work may not be immediately deemed professional by those inside work. And to claim that authenticity is an all or nothing golden ticket that is necessary for leadership puts another barrier in people's minds between where they are now and imagining themselves in that position of leading others.
I love the irony of the social media thing around authenticity, because 90% of the stuff I see on social media, my instant assumption is that's probably not true, or it's been stretched slightly at best, but it's definitely not authentic, in being the first word that pops to my mind. And then I guess the second thing is, yeah, I agree with you. Authenticity is not a case of on or off, is it? And it doesn't have to be, I think, to employ that effectively as a leader. It depends on so many different things, and you as an individual leader have to make that decision about what you're comfortable sharing. I think the key aspect of it is that it's honest.
Yeah.
I think there's quite a few, I don't want to drop any names because it's probably quite unfair to them, but there's a few people I've encountered over the years, let's say, who have realized that authenticity is important, and so they've tried to achieve that, but they've done it in a very inauthentic way and ended up making the problem a lot worse than it was to start with. So I think, you could, if some people might be very comfortable sharing everything they do in their whole life all the time with the people they work with, if so, great. I think you're still going to hit some of the problems you've talked about, but it's not necessary. It's enough to just say, well, here's how I'm feeling about this work matter that's happened, and just be open and genuine and authentic about your reactions to that, for example. It doesn't mean you have to tell everyone what you had for dinner last night and for every night for the last 6 months. I agree with you. It's a very misunderstood thing.
It's the sexy parties. Like, you can have, if you want to have sexy parties, have sexy parties. You don't have to tell everyone at work about it.
Yeah. Some people just have no understanding of boundaries, though, do they?
Right? There's a fascinating book called Consuming Life, Zygmunt Bauman. But he talks about this consumer society where we are there's not just conspicuous consumption where we buy things to let other people know who we are. Do you know, I wear these shoes and so you know something about me, for example. And corporate life is full of that. I have this suit, I have this tie. What I'm wearing says something about me relative to you. The other side of that is that we sell ourselves as products. And one of the things that we have become used to as consumers is lots of information on a product. So if you hit up an Amazon product page, there's loads of bullet points and reviews and descriptions and further information, and you can gather a lot of information about that product, what it looks like, who else has liked, all of its features and benefits, in a way that you didn't if you walked into a shop and picked up a toaster. You'd be like, well, I like this one. There wasn't the same quantity of information. But this society, which both sells us as products and we buy products to sell ourselves, means that we are oversharing. We are giving out more and more information about ourselves in the hope that it builds trust. Here's everything about me. Do you trust me in the same way as you would trust that that's a good toaster? But where, like you say, are the boundaries, are the limits, are the privacy versus intrusion, when we look at how we then start going into people's lives and taking information when they don't offer that freely. And then we make a judgment, not just on the information that we have learned, but the fact that they didn't tell us. Why would they not have told us this thing, which, when you look at it in isolation, is completely fine?
Yeah, it's wrapped up in a lot of different things, isn't it? I think for me, it's always got to be a personal decision about what you are comfortable sharing, which then, of course, links it to things like confidence and your workplace culture, and whether it's acceptable to withhold things because they're private. I mean, as you say, that never used to be a problem. But then the other aspect of it, I guess, is around this idea of professionalism, again, in the inverted commas. And if you're going to be judged for sharing something that is true, is authentic, but is somehow seen as unprofessional, I mean, first of all, if you're talking about a hobby, let's say, that people think is a bit rubbish or whatever, I mean, it's none of their business what you do when you're not at work. Like, I mean, if you've shared that, great, good on you. You shouldn't then be judged for it.
No, right. One of the other people in the organizational minority find, we'll just call them that bucket, is hypervisibility. So sometimes, and I would find this in offices, people, because I worked in tech and finance, people go, Libby, you're a woman. What do you think about? And then there would be a news story or something that was happening, because I was the sample poll of one. And then my opinion would become I spoke to a woman and she said it's fine or it's not fine. or it's somewhere in between. And you become aware of this, that your opinion is then used to reflect the opinion of lots of people like you who aren't in that room. And the weight of that can feel really heavy. It can be enough to stop you talking about yourself because you don't want people to think this is true for everybody who's like that. And so you share less of yourself as well. And that means you're more difficult to know. There's that likability, which has a real impact on how easily you might find it to get things done in the organization as well, whether or not you're liked. So yeah, there's a complex web of what you share, how you share it, who you tell it to, when you tell it to, that is much more strategic if you are in the organizational minority than I expect it is for those who are not, who are stumbling across articles about being vulnerable. And then, yeah, I'll just try that, give that a go and see how that works next month.
Yeah, I do hate that whole phenomenon, let's call it. It really was. I've seen it in action and experienced it in a very minor scale myself. The time I saw it in action was something, it was quite small, but actually it was extremely indicative of the culture and the thinking of this particular leader. And they would always, it was a man, and they would always go to the nearest woman when they needed a cup of tea being made for a guest. And so their logic for that was, well, that other woman who used to work for me never had a problem with it, therefore it's fine if I do it now, it's not sexist. And you're just like, no, stop that at once, please.
Yeah.
And it's exactly that. I mean, there's other problems wrapped up in that, of course, but it's exactly the same thing, isn't it? It's the drawing a generalization from the sole experience of one person. And it's madness when you think about it in those terms. Yeah.
And it's difficult. And it's sometimes people, when I say I work with women, one of the questions that often comes up is, but, you know, I've had a female boss and she was the worst boss I've ever had. She was really hard on me and she was much harder than any other boss. And why do you think that is? And one side of it is, part of it is probably because you had different expectations of her than you did any of your male bosses. And so that has colored the way that you interpret what she's doing. But as you describe, there will be all of these things that she had to push back on. That sense of onlyness, of being the only one in that room who needed to go, no, I'm not doing that. And you're like, oh, it's weird. That's not what I was led to expect. But yeah, that's a question that comes up often, is these women who are, it doesn't take a lot to be considered a difficult woman, is one of the quotes. And that is why there are so many. Well,
I mean, if it helps anyone, I've always gone out of my way to be considered a difficult man. At least from boss's perspective.
Boss's perspective. The other challenge as well is when you are one of very few female leaders, you become you can become quite a vigilant gatekeeper, because you are aware that the same will apply to everybody else that moves up. So if you move someone into a position of authority and they aren't brilliant, then you know that other people will look at her and say, well, she's not very good, and I will use that to judge all other women. So that can be the other part, just this vigilance of ensuring that the minority are the absolute gold standard because of the way it reflects on the majority.
Yeah, that sort of reminds me of this, I say well-known and established problem without any data to back up that statement, but it's the social media quote almost of, there are literally thousands, probably hundreds of thousands of inept and incompetent male managers, but very, very few female managers of any sort. And why is that? And it's that perpetual question. And I think maybe that it's related to what you've just said. I don't know. But
might be that kind of gatekeeping. Is it the Peter principle, getting promoted to the point of incompetence?
Yeah.
Right? Once you get to a level that you can't do, you're not going to get promoted out of that, are you? So you're just gonna sit there. I read a interesting study that looked at the gender pay gap as well, that looked at one theory was that men are more likely to quit if they are not getting the recognition or pay that they deserve, and women hang on in there. And so once you've got a job that you know you're not very good at, you're not going to, I mean, if they're not quitting, then they know they've got a good deal despite not going anywhere. Interesting, right?
It is, yeah. And there are two other aspects of that I've heard as well about. Men are more likely to ask for a pay rise, and they're also more likely to negotiate before they sign their contract when they're employed.
Interesting. I think I might have read something. So I've read those, but there's something newer going around which says that the asking is similar rates. The yes and no is different, but also the negative consequences of having asked are different. And so when female candidates say or try and negotiate a higher rate, they go, oh, she's been really difficult. She's not even got the job yet.
It's back to the same problem we were talking about earlier, isn't it? About
being sugar and spice and all things nice and happy dog tails.
Yeah, that's depressing, actually.
Don't let it depress you.
Yeah. One of the problems that we've been skirting around a little bit is one of the things I've heard from a few others that I've spoken with about this particular problem is women kind of face it's not really a double standard. I guess it's a difficult decision, isn't it? About do you spend your effort advocating for change and trying to make things more fair in the workplace, or is it better to spend your energy on navigating the way it is now until you're in a position to make that change yourself?
I am solidly in the second camp.
Okay.
The work that I do is to try and get exceptional women into senior roles and then to hold on to them. Not just hold on to them, but to absolutely smash it when they are there, to have the time of their life and make a real impact in their industry while they're in that role, so that it inspires others to move up the organization. And I'll tell you why. One, because I think sometimes the advocating for change activity is additional side of desk work that isn't properly compensated or rewarded. And so you get lots of early career or middle management women who pour a huge amount of time into additional work for their ERG, their employee representative group. And it doesn't move the needle for them or for a lot of the women who are supporting it. So I think it's a bit of a distraction. It's certainly not something that others need to be looking at in terms of where they focus their efforts. And so that imbalance, I think, is unfair. And it pours everyone to this same bucket. So when you look at the challenges which are faced by women in organizations and how they get progression, by putting everyone into the woman bucket and saying this is what all women need, not only is an additional burden for the women who are working towards that agenda, it stops you from forming coalitions with other groups in the organization. So let's use parenthood, for example. Shared parental leave is a benefit for all parents. And yet it's often something which is a conversation which is driven by women ERGs. Whereas if you had a smaller action group, which was all parents across the organization, that's looking at a specific goal. So if they're looking at a change in HR policy or a change in the way that hybrid working or working, whatever that looks like for them, I think that would have more impact for that organization than a group of people who often have very little in common other than their gender. Everyone's a different age. Everyone has different views on starting a family, having a family, on their caring responsibilities, on what their career looks like. It feels almost, sometimes being in them feels almost a little uncomfortable because you're making so many compromises to try and find one thing to push forwards that nothing really gets pushed forwards. So in one answer, drive change from the top, succeed in the organization as it is, and then inspire others. And in the second, the groups, form them around the things that you want to change, not the person that you are, because you will find points of coalition with people all over the organization that doesn't make it a women's problem. It makes it a problem which affects 25% of the organization. And that feels more impactful, which I know it shouldn't be, but it also feels more impactful what you're doing. Where groups or networking groups of a shared identity are really valuable is for that, it's for networking. So rather than it being for driving change in the organization or building awareness, and I use this for all of the ERGs, however many you have in your organization, when you start somewhere, your opportunities come through your connections. Somebody will mention you, there'll be a new project or a new role or something will happen that you are unaware of and someone will mention your name. And that's how most careers progress. But when you're in the minority, it's a little bit more difficult to make those connections. You don't go to the coffee machine and see somebody that looks like you. That's why if you go to big networking events, people that look similar tend to gravitate towards each other because you expect that you will have some kind of shared social context that you can make some kind of small talk about. And it all just makes everything just a little bit easier when you're feeling uncomfortable about introducing yourself. But when you're in an organization, you meet fewer people, and then those fewer people connect you to fewer people. And over a period of 1 year, the difference between your internal network and the internal network of someone who can just bump into someone that looks like them all over the building or in every meeting they're in is huge. And that means the gap in the opportunities available to you is huge. So where these groups work really well is it engineers those connections, right? You're all in the same room and you can have a chat and people know who you are, and it makes it a little bit easier. Not because everyone you know in the organization will always look like you, but if you meet a woman who's already been there for 3 years and has a wider network, it cues you into her network faster than just waiting to be in the ladies at the same time, right? So that's where they're really useful. Building your network so it keeps pace with those who are in the organizational minority. Where they are really damaging is sucking time and energy from people who could otherwise be focusing that energy and progressing their own careers.
I don't think that's going to take off as an approach to networking either, if I'm honest. Just hanging around in the toilets and
I mean, I've made a lot of conversations because you'll have a big meeting and everyone's set, and then you're just there washing your hands and you're like, oh, I think you made an interesting point earlier. And then you've got a little conversation. Who's not doing deals in the toilets?
in my experience, men.
All right, yeah, well, maybe that's something that you need to...
Yeah. But there's a social convention, like you don't talk to each other in the gents. You definitely make no eye contact. You just do what you need to do and get out.
I'm surprised you're in charge of everything when you're putting deals in the toilet.
I agree with you, your position on that. I think I like the approach you've described, apart from toilets. But and I guess the other advantage of it is over time, it's going to achieve what advocating for change would achieve anyway. It's just you don't have that distraction from also doing a good job, as you say. Right.
And it does, there's a bit of woke washing from organizations as well that point at the number of, we have 6 ERGs and we each has 600 members. Yeah, but what's your HR policy? Judge an organization on its policies, not on its performative groups or cupcakes or flags or banners, the things that it does that doesn't cost it anything else, that isn't a difficult conversation to have, is just a distraction for people who are already have enough barriers to overcome.
Yeah, absolutely. What advice would you offer to a first-time leader who's maybe struggling to make progress in their new role?
To everybody, I give the same advice, which is that you need to be doing less. There is a mindset shift when you move from high-performing individual contributor to that of leader. I've heard it said that leadership is getting the things you want done by getting other people to want to do it. And so if you are finding yourself doing more and more work, sticking your hand up for more and more opportunities, that you're getting involved in what other people are doing so often that they feel comfortable dropping the ball and allowing you to pick it up, we sometimes get into this space where we think the harder I work, eventually this will somehow manifest into recognition or opportunity or gratitude even, that I've done such a huge amount for this team. They will be grateful enough that they will do what I need or what the business needs or what the project needs. I think sometimes it comes from school, that we are given projects that we work hard on and we are graded. But as a leader, if you can point to I've got all of these documents and I've done all of this stuff, but if your team isn't doing what you need them to do, you are not leading them. And so I would take a really good look at what you are doing and understand that as a leader, you only really have 3 levers to pull, which is clarity, commitment, and consequences. Everything else, you need to allow people to do their own jobs and to build your network of information and influence. I think that, especially when you start in leadership, you pick up busy work. Let the busy work go. Allow other people responsibility for achieving their goals. Provide them with clarity and support, but your network is absolutely where you need to be focusing your attention, because the information that you get, the information that you give, and the way that you build influence, because that's what leadership is, right? Understanding what it is that somebody else wants and how to help them get it.
Absolutely. I want to say that was an Eisenhower quote.
Was it?
I think so. It's trying to remember it exactly, but paraphrasing, it was about the art of leadership is in persuading others to do things you want them to do because they think they want to do it, or something like that.
It is.
I'll look it up afterwards.
And then just again, but that's it. We work really hard, and we're rewarded for working really hard. And if you want something done, give it to a busy person. And I speak to lots of leaders who can be really senior in the organization and are still just incredibly busy. They are in every meeting and they are across every report and they know what everybody is doing because that's how they maintain control over what's happening, because they haven't built that trust that allows people sometimes to fail. That's the big shift, right? Sometimes the people who work for you won't do a job as well as you would have done it, or they might just not do it at all. And your job is to dole out the consequences. It's not to do it for them. It's to consistently and fairly dole out consequences.
Yeah, I think there's a line to walk there, isn't there? But I do agree. I mean, you shouldn't be doing it for them. I think, if you do the work for them once, then you're doing it forever, because why would they ever do it?
Right.
They know you're just going to pick it up and do it for them.
Exactly.
There's no gain for them there.
No.
But I do think at the same time, there is a responsibility to be aware at least of what's going on and ready to be there to support, to help, to be the sounding board, to offer some advice or guidance. And you do have to know what's going on in order to do that effectively, I think. But yeah, that doesn't mean literally have your finger in every single pie, which is a horrible metaphor in this context, but I couldn't think of a better one.
It's the difference between being ready and being prepared. Have a team that knows that you are available to them when you need them. That if something has gone wrong or they need further clarity on the ask, or they need a decision because there's they can't reach that decision within their team, knowing that you are available to them is exactly what they need from a leader. When we look at leaders who are from dawn till dusk in meetings, and that if you want to speak to them, you needed to have booked it 2 weeks ago, it sends a very clear message to the team that you're managing that you are not available to them because you are in so many status update meetings because you are checking in to see what's happening. And then they go, oh, well, we couldn't get you. And you're like, but I was in the meeting on Monday when you told me everything was fine. Well, sometimes that's true. And then Tuesday it isn't. So I think there's the being over things, but also just being available. That lighter touch, I think, takes a level of confidence and experience that certainly in your earlier career, when you're like, it's my job to make sure they do their job. It's not. It's their job to make sure they do their job. You just need to ensure that they have everything they need in order to be able to do it.
Yeah, exactly. It's your job to make sure they can do their job.
Yeah.
Via whatever means that involves. I think the other couple of aspects, I mean, there's loads of stuff about leadership that we could talk about on there, but I think two others I would flag would be spend your time talking up your people within the organisation. I think they won't always do it for themselves, and I do think that's part of the responsibility of a leader is to make sure your people are seen. And then it's the personal development and making sure you're giving them opportunities to upskill or do some research on something that interests them, and that aspect of it as well. Yeah,
giving them space to grow and the opportunity to do it, and knowing what that looks like through different generations of leaders is not quite the way to put it, but sometimes people get stuck in a role because they are too valuable. They are impossible to replace because they have organically created a role which only they can do. It fits exactly to their experience and skill base. How do you replace that person? And some bad managers will then just not. They'll just keep that person exactly where they are. So it's about not allowing that to happen as well. Where those opportunities you add on, you also take other things away and have a view of your team and how the team will evolve rather than plugging the spaces in.
Yeah, definitely. There's a crossover there between the leadership and the management skill sets, isn't there? There's the leadership aspect of looking after that person, but then there's the organizational and administrative aspect of the management of making sure structurally that's not going to become a single point failure, as one of my former bosses used to call it.
Yeah. People talk about leadership as an aspirational form of management or being greater than management, but the two are absolutely essential because you don't have there will always be finite resources. You don't have unlimited promotions. You don't have unlimited opportunities. You don't have as many people as everybody needs to do all of their projects. And so you do need to make difficult decisions. And sometimes that means that the best opportunity for someone in your team is outside of that team. And that leadership part of you might want to keep giving them opportunities and keep giving them stretch goals and keep growing them. But really, they're just growing larger than the role that you've got them in, which isn't fair to them either.
100%. I've always maintained that if you want to be really good at either one, you have to be good at both leadership and management.
I think that's true.
I think anyone can sort of play at either one on their own without doing the other, but yeah. Not going to get the best out of everyone.
No, you're not. It's that you need the strategy and the tactics, right?
Yeah, we're back to those words again. Yeah. If you could start your career over again, would you do anything differently?
I would take the advice that I have just given. I would focus more on network and relationships. When I was at school, the Venn diagram of popular and academically successful was binoculars, right? There was no overlap there. And that gets reinforced by teachers as well. They go, don't worry. When you're a grown up, when you're in the outside world, popularity won't pay your bills. And I think to some extent, that's just something you say to nerdy kids to make them feel better. Because when I got into the working world, I worked hard. And I didn't pay enough attention to the relationships that were around me. And I judged those that did. And then I was annoyed and frustrated that they were getting opportunities that I wasn't, because I was working harder. And all they did was go for coffee with lots of different people all of the time. And I think if I was starting again, I would sharpen that learning curve, and rather than sitting in judgment, realize that any organization is a product of the sum of its parts. And so the better connected you are within that organization, the more value you can add than as an individual contributor who's just got their head down.
That's a very good answer, I must say. I think, yeah, I'm a latecomer to the importance of networking as well. I was very skeptical of it.
Right.
Pretty much the entire time I was full-time employed, I viewed it as like the worst thing you could ever do with your time.
Yeah.
And funnily enough, once I became a solo business owner, suddenly I realised actually that's quite an important thing to do, isn't it?
Yeah, it's absolutely everything. And the switch, when you're employed and you're in corporate, your name means nothing. The thing that people are attuned to is your role title in the company. Is it a high company? Is it a big company? And then they lean in or glaze over. And so when you start working as a solo entrepreneur, when you start your own business, how quickly you need to learn how to introduce yourself so that people don't wander off immediately is make or break for your business. And I think if we could introduce a little of that into our corporate lives, so it's not something you don't learn till afterwards, I think that would make a huge difference.
Yeah, I think the value of doing it internally within your organization when you're an employee, and especially when you're a new manager as well, because you're going to need access to all those various resources and people now in a way that you maybe didn't before. Yeah, I don't think you could underestimate that, to be honest.
It's huge.
Leadership Heroes.
Okay, well, I can't quite believe how long we've been talking. Time's been flying. I've only got one question left I'm going to ask you. Everyone gets this question. It's one of my favourites. So it's called Leadership Heroes.
Mm-hmm.
And the question is, if you had to pick one person, they could be anyone you like, alive, dead, past, present, real, fictitious, who in your opinion would perfectly embody leadership. Who would that person be and why?
I actually found this really easy.
Oh, I mean, good. Yeah.
My person is a fictional leader, and his name is Captain Jean-Luc Picard.
Oh.
The USS Enterprise D. And I watched Next Generation Star Trek. It was on every Wednesday. And I was at school, and after Neighbours changed to BBC Two, and it was on then. And I learned, now that I watch it again, and I'm a huge Star Trek fan, and I watch other series, the model of leadership within Starfleet. I think he was the first one that I was properly introduced to, but I could have chosen any of them. I am reminded of times where he would sit and it would be this incredibly high risk scenario and thousands of lives are on his shoulders. And what are you going to do? And he would call his most trusted advisors and they would sit around a table and he would say, explain this to me. And there would be engineering mind, and there would be a security mind, and there would be an empathetic perspective. And he would allow everybody to talk about their expertise, both from a position of knowledge, but also what their opinions were as individuals, the things that were important to them. And then he would make a decision. And I thought it was incredible because it wasn't something that he did. He didn't seem to bring anything to that other than the decision making. And yet the people that he led were encouraged to grow. They trusted him. They knew that they'd been listened to. Even when he decided that he wasn't going to do something that they had recommended, they immediately went, well, then I understand that this is necessary, that it's important, because the trust there, the credibility, and because he had listened to them when he decided on what was to be done, they picked it up immediately. And then they all ran around and then they shot this thing and they blew that thing up and I know it's an odd thing for a teenage girl to become absolutely obsessed by, but this model of collaborative leadership, and also as being a kind of a weird teenage girl as well, everybody at that table was completely different. I mean, some of them were entirely different species, but it didn't seem to come up. It was a truly diverse team, but in decades before we were even really talking about that. And I don't know that I had labeled it to myself, but I knew that those people could turn up and they didn't need to worry about anyone thinking they were weird. They could say, oh, I think we should blow them out of the sky. And everyone go, calm down, right? But they didn't go, you are being weird. They were like, let's blow them out of the sky. It's plan B, right? That's what we'll do next. And so immediately I read this question. I was like, it's got to be Jean-Luc.
I'm sorry to tell you, he's been picked quite a few times.
He is by far the best. By far the best. And I'm glad that he's been picked. And I can't even go for another one.
No, it's fine. I'm not asking you to. It's just I think your story about why you've chosen him is really nice, really good, well explained, and again, different in quite a few places to other people who've chosen him. So
why did they love a bit of Jean-Luc?
I think that what always seems to be a commonality is the fact that he took time to consider his options and he would gather other opinions. Now I'm also quite a Trekkie. I grew up in an original series house though, because my mother was of the generation that watched that when it first came out, and she was always a Trekkie, and that's where I got it from. And I do think it is interesting because people do talk about Picard in that way, that he gathers all these expert opinions. But Kirk did that as well. He just didn't like hit pause on the crisis and go into the meeting room in order to do it. Text.
That's why I didn't get
his
been all over Kirk. He would never have been out of disciplinary hearings.
Well, yeah, there is that aspect of it, but I think that it's difficult, isn't it, a TV series and the era in which it was made, and we could talk about that till the cows come home, as they say. But I don't know. I mean, on that particular aspect, though, Kirk did still consider other opinions. He was always in discussion with his most trusted advisors, because they were usually his right and left hand, respectively. It's not as if he was just the snap fire immediately and cause a war without thinking kind of leader either. So, I mean, not to diminish Picard either.
Picard every time. If you want to get
for me, it would be Sisko, though. I have to say, he would be my pick of a Star Trek captain.
It went a bit weird with the wormhole aliens.
It did, but it is sci-fi, so you expect a bit of weird.
It's in the boundaries with fantasy.
Anyway, we're going to get into a Star Trek only episode if we carry on like this.
Other thing that's interesting about Picard is there is an episode where he dies, and Q gives him. He dies because his heart failed. He has an artificial heart, and Q gives him the option of going back in time and avoiding the fight in which he was stabbed in the heart, and so got an artificial one, and so in later years saves his life. And it's very it's a wonderful life. It's like It's a Wonderful Life, right? And then he comes back into the future and he never made it into leadership because that early life risk, that near death experience is what set him on a course for leadership that he was always willing to do. He was the one that was willing to do when others were still stopped. And so although he does have that consideration, I mean, he's got a fake heart.
Great. Well, Libby, thank you so much for all of your time today. It's been a great episode. I've really enjoyed this conversation. I hope you have as well. Yes. The last thing I'll just ask you is if any of the listeners, I'm sure loads of them will, would like to learn more about you, maybe get in touch or possibly even work with you, is there a website or anything else you would like to direct them towards?
The fastest way to get me is my LinkedIn, which is /Libby Vincent. And they can find me there and they can message me directly.
Lovely. Okay. And I'll pop the link in the episode description as well so everyone can find it easily.
Great. Well, thank you very much.
Well, thank you for all your time and being a great guest. Some important topics covered today, and I hope, listener, that it has given you a bit of inspiration for your own leadership experiences too. Huge thanks again to Libby for that conversation. I really enjoyed it, and we covered some As I say, really interesting and nuanced topics there around leadership and the impact it can have on people from different backgrounds, different genders even. If you'd like to learn more about Libby, her consultancy, and what she gets up to, then check the show notes for more information. Thank you for listening today. If you've enjoyed hearing this episode, then please consider leaving a review or a rating to let me know. Tune in again next week when I will be joined by Kelly Tinnin, specialist in performance improvement and organizational development. We're going to be discussing those topics, as well as the challenges faced in entrepreneurship, in leadership, the vital role of humility, vulnerability, and kindness, and more besides. And once more, don't forget, visit www.leadernotaboss.com. Sign up to join Integrity Leaders, my online community of leaders like you. You'll find that link and my LinkedIn details as well in the episode description. So as always, feel free to reach out for a chat anytime. Always happy to talk about leadership, and I would love to hear from you as well. I'll be back next week. Talk to you then. And in the meantime, be a leader, not a boss.